So first, I'd like to ask Professor Jackson, do you have any response to Dr. Yip, or Dr. Johnson, for his two perspectives, Jeremiah and Ezekiel?
Thank you. I was very appreciative of the way I think you brought to our attention those two perspectives as reflected in Jeremiah 29 and Ezekiel 11, which have always fascinated me because much as with the work of my student Kamal Weerakun, who was hearing people position themselves differently regarding the Australian society that they're now part of, here you have a very good example, I guess, of learning within the Jewish community where so much of what they do is done through dialogue and dialectic and engagement, disagreement even, which is encouraged. So I can imagine these, an imaginary conversation between Ezekiel and Jeremiah, one of them saying, oh, it's a great, you should just do this is how we should live, and Ezekiel going, absolutely not. That's totally the wrong thing. And this for me is the value of respectful, careful scholarship that listens to those who are different to us. And I guess if I had any kind of response, and I'm not a biblical theologian, so a biblical scholar, so I'm reflecting the work of others. So the work of Brian Collier in imagining Kohelet as this kind of skeptic who might be argued to sit somewhere in the middle and to say, well, neither of you have got this quite right, because it's all pretty bad. And as Collier says, this is actually the anti-revelatory revelation. It's actually a revelation out of the darkness, which points in a different direction. And he says, it's all bad. It didn't work back there. It's not working here. So thank you. I really appreciated this acknowledgement on the part of biblical scholars that these texts emerge out of the lived realities of our biblical authors who were part of these communities in exile. And I found it a deeply and rich reflection. Thank you.
Okay. As the chair for this meeting, I would like to ask the first question to Professor Jackson. The four writers you mentioned, all of them have, you may say, a very intensive reflection of their own experience being a migrant. I found that, for many Christians, well, Chinese Christians in particular, because many Chinese has experienced some form of migration, whether themselves or whether their parents are migrants. Like most Hong Kong people, their parents are migrants from mainland China. But even though they are migrants, they do not like to reflect on the particular migrant identity. They don't like that kind of question. They want to talk about something more stable. I mean, in a sense, many Chinese Christians, I think they actually like the Eurocentric theology. I mean, Tim Keller, John Piper, Chris Wright, those writings are translated into Chinese and they're very popular because this kind of writing kind of gives them a sense of stability. I mean, using the analogy of the ocean makes you seasick. You want land theology. For those, if there are Christians like that, how would you encourage them to be more self-reflective, to think about their migrant experience, or to think about shifting culture and be more multicultural in their faith? How would you encourage them?
That is a really helpful question that I think, again, I will look forward to graduating alongside another PhD student this March. A scholar called Amy Shum. And Amy's work is looking at Christian communities in Sydney within the largely Cantonese-speaking community, so Chinese churches. She rejects this notion that she's migrant. She struggles with it. She does not want to own that label. But clearly she is first generation. A woman in her 50s, 60s, one might say, but resistant to this label. And it's led me to ponder the fact that maybe just as Jeremiah and Ezekiel had this discussion, are you a migrant, Jeremiah? What about you, Ezekiel? Are you a migrant? Are you diasporan? How do you? There is, I think, an important part to recognize that we own these labels or reject them. And that tells us something about how we're actually trying to process the place we find ourselves in. And the skepticism of Ecclesiastes in some part might be a resistance or reluctance to own the label of the new place. But I think all of us take with us a sense of the desire to create stability, to create homeland. If I look at the needs of the communities of believers in Melbourne at the moment from Myanmar, much of what they do as church community is a desire to re-establish the stability of their homeland, which largely takes place on a Sunday morning for 4 hours. And they are suddenly living Myanmar again. And they're able to deal with the trauma of separation from the homeland and the journey that has traumatized them and the conflict in Myanmar that has traumatized them. And so church becomes a really important reality. But the fact that you find yourself in a particular place, however you identify, Chinese, Chin, European, and the extent to which you use the work of your European theologians, such as those you mentioned, is not in and of itself a bad thing. Of course they're valuable, they say valuable things. As Daniel reminded us yesterday, his own, what he's drawn from Tim Keller is valuable. But they are not universal, they're not speaking, as it were, representing universal authority. They are part of a broader Christian conversation, which continually finds itself saying, it's this, no, it's that. What about this? Oh, I've not thought about that. We find ourselves in this ongoing conversation, and I think that's what I would want to say, is that they are conversation partners. And we need to resist any sense that because they speak with a particular accent and have a particular skin tone, that they are therefore more authoritative, more normative. And I think that's what I want to resist. As somebody who's saying, this is how we describe migration, diaspora, I might be wrong in suggesting that you are a diasporan or you are a migrant. I might be wrong. That's how I feel, but I can't say it of you.
That's a question?
Sorry. Panels, everybody. My name is Connie again. I'm so excited and really enjoyed the lecture today. But first question though, I really enjoy that you share one of your student study, slogan Bradley. The study was conducted in 2009. So I'm wondering, is he overcome the seasick yet? So where's the Bradley today? I'm curious. As a student, I'm a theology student. He's working on his thesis, and we're doing my thesis as well. So I'm curious, where's Bradley today? Did you know where he is right now?
Where is who, sorry?
The students that you helped.
Oh, where are they now?
Yeah.
So they're all still living in Australia.
Okay.
Yep, and so one of them, one of them is now back in Samoa. So okay. Brian Collier is now in Samoa. But of course, as an Australian citizen, he has the possibility of returning to Australia. He has certain obligations to the supporting denomination in Samoa, which paid for his PhD. So he's serving alongside of them for a period, and will probably move into a pastoral position in Australia or in Samoa. Wirakun is in Sydney, okay. Budden is in Australia, Jouli is in Melbourne. So they're all still living in Australia.
Okay, thank you. So I really enjoy about this immigration issues because I myself is also immigrant to US in 1996. So I've been living in US a little over almost 30 years. And, but I think the identity, I think my daughter, today she is 27. When she was in high school, she was really struggling this identity. I think this newer generation has more trouble than we were. I'm in my 50s. But I think one of the important things that we have one common identity is that we are all God's children. When you mention about this privilege that white people have, I'm wondering who gave you that. So I think to break that wall off in this generation is that we all have to believe we have one identity in Christian world, is that we are all God's children. So whenever that who come into uprise in these issues, we all have to be very careful. Because we have to show the understanding why we still think that. I think in this era, it's our uprising responsibility to break that. At least that's how I felt. So my question to us, you know what, every time when I go to preaching, one of my first things is God was like banging my head because I had to thank my foremost generations, because if not of any of you that continue to work on the theologies, that I wouldn't be where I am today, right? So my question is you that since you have knowing this contextual or racism or any society problems that it's like never break through, right? It has been in generation after generations. So really our job is, how can we break that? What is the revelation from God? How can we work together to really make through of these challenges? Had to be some resolutions. And this, I hope, in this 2025, right? We went through year of 2000. Everybody said everything was gonna fall apart in year 2000. Remember that era? That computer was gonna knock down and things gonna shut off. But guess what? 2025, after 25 years, we're still here. So I think God is mercy and graceful. And I'm really definitely looking for hope. You know, we have a theology of hope, theology of love, theology of peace, where we're going to hear about tonight. So I really want to hear some resolutions, if any professor has bit of it.
So your question is, you know, any resolution to racism and that kind of barriers?
Not really. What my question is, when a Christian, they come into Christianity, for example, they immigrant to non-Christian world, into a Christian world, when their contextual point of view become their barrier to become a Christian, or they're struggling, you know, they may be freedom before, but when they come to Christian, there's so many rules and boundaries, and you know, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. Then all of a sudden, become a Christian, your God hasn't become perfect. How do you break through those boundaries or those bondages to help those contextual sense of it and to help them to become liberated?
Okay, so how do you help Christians liberated from their cultural bondage? I think that's what your question, okay.
Not easily. And the history in Australia suggests that the early Christian colonizers who accompanied the imperial forces, if you like, struggled to do that. I mean, the history of Australia, sadly, is that the theft of land was justified by theologians. The concept of terra nullius, in other words, empty land, was a theological concept. And this was used to justify the theft of land, the theft of the country from its peoples. It was just used to justify genocide because the Aboriginals were not considered human. In fact, shockingly, there is still present in the National War Museum in Canberra, the capital in Australia, a memorial garden that has sculptures of all of the fauna, all of the animals of Australia. One of those heads is an Aboriginal head, a human head as an animal, alongside the kangaroo and all of the koalas that you hear about from Australia. These views were justified by Christians who accompanied the colonizers in Australia. They were not considered to be capable of education, so there's very little biblical translation work done in Australia in order to evangelize the Aboriginal peoples when they first arrived. They were seen to be a people that were likely to have no future. So these views, really difficult for, I think, Christians to sometimes let go, despite the fact that, as you say, we claim that these are all God's children. But if they're not human beings, it's a moot point.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I haven't got any question on the WhatsApp yet. I just wonder, the speakers, do you...
I have a question, actually. Okay. Yeah, to follow up, if that's okay. I was fascinated by the images you used. The first one, the Chinese using the steamboat as the image. The second one, the Samoan ocean. And you made a lot of comments on the Aborigines. I was wondering, for the Aborigines, is there any particular image or object that they find it helpful for them to reflect theologically as the first people, not the second people, in terms of theological reflection? Is there any image that they... Because, I mean, there are many, many images of Aborigines. Anything in particular they think, this is really helpful for me to think about theologically?
Yeah. The image that they would primarily use is land. And so and this is the interesting contrast between the Pacific theologians who see water, ocean, as being the thing that brings life and allows them to journey. Whereas for the Aboriginal theologians, they see land and they look back to the deep, they would use the word spiritual connection that exists between the land and themselves as human beings. And so they journey across the land. And so if you look at Aboriginal art, it looks rather odd. The perspective doesn't seem to work, particularly because we put art on the walls. But of course their art is designed to be drawn in the sand, because that was the canvas. So you looked above. And so everything that and if you looked very carefully, and it may not have been easy to see on the screen, but in the backdrop to my slides, there was this interesting pattern of dots. And these are typical Aboriginal art forms. And this particular one was designed to show the movement of people across the land. So every time you put a dot, it's like a footprint in the sand. And you see little crescents, which is really where somebody sits in the sand, and they stand up, and there you have the impression of their buttocks on the ground. And so everything is designed to show this sense of people meeting, moving. And so the land is deeply, deeply important for the Aboriginal theologian. It's again, the sign of God nurturing, nourishing us. And if we don't treat the land right, then there's damage to not just the ecology, but to the environment. There's also damage to the economy. We can't live without the land. We need it to produce.
No, I find this extremely helpful because this is so much part of the Jewish culture as well, the land. So I think this is really helpful. Thank you.
And we don't own the land. The Aboriginal people don't own the land. They're custodians of it. It owns them, which is also interesting biblical reflection.
Before I forget, I'd like to tell you the bow tie that Dr. Jackson is wearing is actually threads of different nations. Yeah, even his bow tie is multicultural. Okay, so Simon, you have a question?
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Today you have bring me new understanding of the word kinesis. As a secondary student, I was introduced to this idea in my physics class, and I hate it. But you have shared today the beauty of kinesis. And so I'd like to share one comment and ask one question. Well, the comment is, perhaps for these 2 days, one keyword has captured me very much. The word is decentralizing, but more to it is destabilizing. I think the destabilizing element is something that we have to wrestle with. But derived from that, another word pops up, which is the word non-closure. So this element of non-closure somehow is very missed or ignored in our Christian tradition. So this brings me to biblical interpretation in a certain way, because the book of Psalms, when we read it, towards the very end, Psalm 150, we can see movement from the heavenly sanctuary to the earthly sanctuary, and to move towards outside the sanctuary and then to all nations. But it's still an invitation to praise God. The praise has not yet begun. So the whole book ends with an unending. And also with the book of Song of Songs, most people argue that for the last verse, so the two lovers, they are united and their desire have been kind of like fulfilled. But actually, I would think that for that very last verse, actually they're separated and their desire is yet to be fulfilled. So this element of non-closure, just like Ezekiel and also Jeremiah, holds two very different positions on to how the migrants should behave in a foreign land. So I think this is something that we have to wrestle with, to live with, and also as a way so that we can move forward with our theology making. So my question is, you have mentioned in the beginning of your lecture that kinesis movement is an essential element for constructing stable political, social structures. Have I got you wrong? Okay, but I think perhaps I have missed some of the points. So how can that be done? So could you elaborate this more so that we can kind of like embrace this kind of like kinesis in our faith tradition, so that we know that one day we will be there. we will reach the land. Okay, we will no longer be rocking in the sea again. So have I made myself clear? Is the question clear? Yes, thank you.
I'm sure others will want to contribute, hopefully, at some point. You'll notice the language that I did use from Neil is somewhat negative language to describe people. So they're vagabonds, they're nomads, they're proletariat, they're people expelled. So much of modern day migration policy, and I've been, as a European, particularly interested in the legal mechanisms that are put in place by various nation states to essentially control the movement of people, to suit its own purposes, or to expel, as we are now seeing, obviously, in the US. But one of the assumptions that's made in that is that the nation state is normative, that any form of a life beyond it that is not stable, that doesn't reflect stasis, is therefore suspect or dangerous or threatening, subversive. Nail's point simply is this, that nation states are themselves the creation of people in movement, and that they owe this, they have a huge debt to this particular heritage. And so any sense that the stasis should be valued and protected and fought for and defended needs always to live in this kind of tension with the fact that we began in movement. And so Nail's argument is that as these people find themselves expelled, so let's say convicts, British politicians, British leaders, British army who moved out of England and found themselves in Australia, established a new nation state. They established stasis. Because, of course, when people move, as Brian Collier's work suggests, you take your mo'ata with you, you're taking your home. You're establishing homeland. And so there is always this human, one might say, central condition that we wish to develop patterns of community and of society in new places. And so this is what leads to eventually to the stability that we now know as the nation state. I hope that answers the question, but that's an attempt to unpack some of what I rather quickly skated over in the first part.
Dr. Lee, you have something to say?
I want to bring up a more, it's an adjacent issue, but I think more of a basic question. Let's think about just theology in general. Like we tend to say, because we began by thinking, here's European theology and here's majority world theology, or that's how we could dichotomize in a sense. But now that we're there, let's go further, okay? Because, as I started yesterday, I commented yesterday, that sometimes the so-called contextual theologies don't necessarily serve the people. And the people don't like it. And they don't use it. And the question is it because the people are just colonized and they just like white things, or is there a problem with the contextual theologies themselves? Let me break it down just a little bit, right? The site of modern theological production is in the university. That is odd, because it was not always so, right? People did theology in the church, later on in the cloister, right? Monasteries. Now it's the university. The only weird thing about doing theology in the university is that usually it's done by an individual, not necessarily reflecting a community. You think they would be reflecting a community, but not necessarily. You go to university, you're an individual, you are in the context, if you're in university, in the context of a broader European or white guild. Even if your professor is an Asian American or a person of color, they're still part of the white guild. Because they're trying to help you survive the white guild. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so if you do it that way, if you produce theology there, it's kind of depressing, right? Because you're like, oh my gosh, we want like non-white theology, and they're doing it this way. It doesn't serve anybody, because it's serving just them. So I always tell people the fact that they're like real contextual theologians who deal with the people, and there's theologies that are written for tenure. Right? They're tenure, and who's it written for? The white academy. And in that context, if you orientalize or make yourself even weirder, it'll sell better to the white audience. They're like, well, if you write about Calvin, everybody has that. Well, write about the weird thing. The stranger it is, the better it is. Right? What I'm trying to say is this, I'm trying to say, how do we make sure that the theologies themselves are ecclesial, right? It's lex orandi, lex credendi, right? So the rule of prayer should be the rule of faith. And what I'm saying is, we might think, great, we have, and I'm not saying of these people, but I'm saying, great, we're going to learn from these, other non-white theologians now. They must be right. And what I want to say is that who uses their theology? If their own people don't use it, which is always, that's been the case for a lot of Asian American theologians, right? So I tell people, I do Asian American theology. I don't necessarily like a lot of Asian American theology because nobody uses it. And Asian Americans just want to use Tim Keller. And I don't think necessarily it's because Tim Keller is better, but I think it's because some of the Asian American theologians are not ecclesial. They're not written in a community. They're not interacting with it. They're not written in such a way so they can use it. It's written for the white academy. And if you write it that way, the dichotomy doesn't help at all. Now you replaced, Calvin and white theology, the Moltmann or whatever, Barth. Sometimes they're more ecclesial because it's easier for them. And then you replace them now with liberal or contextual theologies that are written for the white academy, but just weirder. If you do it that way, the whole thing fails, right? So it seems like it'd be easier, just do that, What I'm saying is there's this whole another complication, and my colleagues who we spend time talking about this thing say, oh, it's not that easy. You would think it would just be solved by now. I'm not going to read European theologians. I'm just going to use all the migrant theologians. It's going to help us. And I still have to ask, who's using that theology? Because it's not always the case just because it's written for that people that they use it. There's a big joke about liberation theology. Liberation theology opted for the poor, and the poor opted for Pentecostalism. They're like, oh, it doesn't help us. You wrote something for us, but we're not really using it. Or you initially used it, like Gutierrez. What's really interesting about Gustavo Gutierrez, who basically came up with liberation theology, later on in his life, he didn't do liberation theology, and people said, how come you're not doing liberation theology? He said, oh, he's a real liberation theologian in the sense that the people moved on, and I just moved on along with them, right? Because he's thinking about that. He's not doing liberation theology for tenure right? And then there are like career liberation theologians who spent the summer with Gutierrez, who wrote a book for White Academy and got tenure. What I'm saying is there's a whole industry called theology, and in that place, there are people who do it like who are Asian American or Asian who write about Calvin or write about whatever, and they can survive the academy that way. And then who write about contextual stuff, but even then they're writing for white people as well. If you understand that, you realize, holy crap, it doesn't really work. There's like a whole other complication. So the fight has to be continuing interacting and saying, does this work? Can we use this in worship? Do you find it helpful? If you don't, I have to go back to the drawing board, right? It doesn't matter how many people give you awards because it's not working. You just have to keep this in mind as we're talking about this thing. If you don't, it'll be like, oh, I guess this is the option. Read Calvin or read migrant theology. And I'm just telling you, there's a whole other criteria of, is it an ecclesial theology? And if you don't think of it that way, you would think, oh, great, I'm going to do more migrant theology. And I'm just saying, you will be disappointed.
In the Chinese context, I think concretely, CS Zone is more popular in the Western world than in the Chinese church. But anyway, you have any response to Dr. Lee?
Look, it's hard not to want to be defensive. But what I do appreciate is the fact that Yang, I've seen her poetry used in worship. It's quite moving, accompanied by image and visuals. Yang's work would be well known, possibly by a different name, in significant parts of mainland China through the distance education that she offers to parts of the Chinese church. Collier's work emerges out of Talanoa, so conversation with his Samoan colleagues. What I find interesting about colleagues who are working in indigenous contexts in Australia is they're not actually allowed to do anything either as indigenous or non-indigenous theologians dealing with indigeneity until they're in a relationship, until they're in community. I have a colleague called Andy who's just finished his PhD, and most of his PhD was done sitting around on the sand with indigenous elders as they shared secret knowledge.
I don't think it's a question of like a critique. It's almost like
it's
you
really
know they're real theologians
absolutely.
and they're contextual and there are people who are not, and you have to evaluate.
Yeah,
right.
but what I do, and I kind of smile internally as you remind me that I'm here because of the work of some of these people. You know, so in a sense, the guild is real.
So there's a question. Is Winnie? You have? Oh.
Yes, I'm Min Lee, and good afternoon. I really appreciate Dr. Jackson's lecture today because you bring the individual case study for us to see the different narratives of the migrant history. Because for myself, I grew up in Taiwan and finished my study in Germany, and I was working in Netherlands and serving in church in Switzerland. And then I homeschooling my kids in USA, and now coming back to Taiwan and writing my theological thesis there. So when I listen to your lecture, I really have a question, actually connect to Dr. Fang's question. My question is, what is the role of each individual in their own migration story? Are they only being an object to receive the cultural impact of the new surroundings? How an individual would be as a responsible self to take their responsibility as a responsible being to standing before God and to respond God in all their surroundings. And this question is also for all the panel. As a theologian, how can we make the connection that we really bring our church to think about our really responsibility before God in this issue? Thank you.
Well, I'll start very quickly. I think what I found interesting, particularly with the work of Brian Collier, and his trying to understand why is Ecclesiastes apparently such a skeptical work? Why is the author so skeptical? And it is, I think, he reflects on that because he says, look, I'm a Samoan. I'm a second generation Australian citizen. Australia's good, but it ain't the best. And I don't want to go back to Samoa either, because that stinks for some things. But some of it's pretty good. And so I think the individuals that I've been fascinated to observe and engage with, and through their work present some of what they're doing and discovering, is to see that they have significantly worked with the places that they are now in, i.e. Australia. And they're not just simply saying, oh, that's it, I'm going to walk around looking like an Australian, sounding like an Australian, singing Australian songs. I know all the words of Waltzing Matilda, which is almost our national anthem. And I know all about kangaroos. Because that's not who they are. They're each processing it differently. So some of the new culture is good, some of it they're skeptical about, some of their traditional culture is good, some of that they're skeptical about too. And that's why Brian drives this sense of, isn't that what Kohelet is all about in Ecclesiastes?
Dr. Ruler, you want to respond to this question or anything we've discussed?
Well, I can give a specific example about my people. So my husband has done some historical research about, I'm Baptist. So he has done, he wrote about Baptist history in the Holy Land, and it started sometime in 1911. And he wrote a book about that, and he noticed that Palestinians who became refugees after the Nakba, which means when Israel was established, Palestinians were scattered. Many of them who went to the surrounding country, they started ministry. They planted churches. And it was really fascinating to see that God can use tragedies to bring a blessing out of it. Only God can do that. So it's easy to reflect on that after a century and say, wow, Nakba, tragedy, and then some blessing, in different countries, starting churches, starting a ministry. But when you are in the midst of that, it's harder to notice that. But if we focus our eyes on God, and we know, the Bible tells us, and if you look at our life, you can see God's hands, through decades, how God can use suffering into blessings, and not necessarily blessings to our life, maybe to others. And as we influence others and be a blessing to others, we are also being blessed. So maybe just to switch the focus, why we are here. It's to bless others, to serve others, and to be Christ-like character. And if we focus on that, everything, our lens will be different. And we start interpreting everything you are hearing now. If we interpret all what we hear, all what we read, all what we see in the news with God's lens, we can have a different way of thinking, a different way of reacting, a different way of being creative in how to serve God and people.
I'm Winnie. Really grateful for Dr. Jackson's sharing today. I think I'm really inspired by what you said about trying to get ourselves to disavow one's privilege and normativity and to self-locate one's theology on the margins. I've been struggling a lot with how to do this in terms of practically listening to and learning from the margins. One limitation I have is the language. For example, the students and colleagues that you mentioned today, they do need to know how to write in English. In order for people from the margins to have a voice, we actually need them to know English and know how to write in English. And the other limitation is the market. I'm an economist, so I'm very sensitive to market forces. I've worked in academia, and I know you have to do certain things and write in a certain way or a certain language in order for a publisher to be willing to publish your work. This is actually very similar to what Dr. Lee was mentioning just now. You might have to write in a certain way to get tenure. So this is why I love our lecture series these 2 days, but also understand my privilege to be able to be here and really enjoy myself because I know English. So I know all our 4 guests, our 4 speakers have a lot of experience listening from and learning from the margins. So I just want to ask about your own experiences, like how it has been for you. Thank you.
I'm not going to claim to be a saint in this respect, but there's a certain self-emptying, I think, that's part of the Christian tradition, which I think is actually part of our discipleship. So what that means in practice is, in my college context, there's an important virtue in ensuring that your non-male, non-white colleagues are part of as the principal, I always want to be at the front. I'm supposed to be at the front and give the lead, but why? Because of why? And so finding a way of actually modeling something that says, actually, your English might not be as natural or fluent as mine, or it's certainly not as accented as mine, but your voice is important. We need to learn from you. You have things to bring that I can't bring. And so it's important for me to sometimes actually just sit, say no more. The number of times that we instinctively want to jump in and say, I know the answer to that question, but to hold back and allow others to articulate their own response is also important. Again, concretely, we've tried to work hard at ensuring that our PhD supervisory teams, which is normally 2, sometimes 3, always have somebody whose first language may not necessarily be English. I can't claim that we've solved the publishing question. I think you're right. Raw economics, unfortunately, gets in the way. And hey, if you're a professor at Fuller, much easier to get published than if you're a professor at the University of Divinity, I can tell you. And so those things are part of the market force that we're all wrestling with. Some of my colleagues are finding alternative routes to publish their work. And there's some really, really fascinating stuff happening in the Pacific with these really proud island nations, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga. They are developing some really high-quality publication initiatives, including journals of high quality. And so those things are really encouraging to have and to hear. But look, there are some answers that we're wrestling with. The motto of my college is towards justice, ad justitiam in Latin. And I like the first part, towards, because we ain't there yet. But that's a reminder that justice is something we have to aspire and work towards and find ways of doing that. So thank you for that reminder and the gentle challenge in your question.
So I'd like to follow up on the question. I'll ask Dr. Fong now. A lot of time when the missionaries, they come to so-called the missionary field, the missionary will be perceived as the more privileged one. They may be a white person or they may be well-educated compared with those people in the mission field. So how do you train or help missionary to cultivate an attitude so that they are not there to give out gifts or they're not superior, but they're to live with the people? How do you cultivate that kind of mentality among your missionaries?
I think the first is to, number one, to avoid dependency. So if you start a work, the first thing we need to help the local people is that they will be leading the work. They will be on their own. We will be working with them, what we call shoulder to shoulder, but not over them, above them. But I think to start with, when you plant a church, the first thing you have to tell them is that they need to be self-supporting. Even though it may be hard, but I think that is the principle of what we call non-dependency. And the second thing is really be very intentional about not to be in control, not to be in positions of leadership, actually intentionally not to be in positions of leadership, but also allowing the local people to lead as well. The third is regarding the question earlier on by Dr. Winnie, and Dr. Jackson's response is in terms of listening to those from the margins. I think OMF is changing in the sense OMF started as a China and then mission, of course, for the first 100 years is all in English. And then, you have Chinese and other people coming and join as well. Now we have come to a stage when we really explore the possibility, whether in any major meetings, can we allow multiple languages? And how do you do that? How do you do that? For example, recently we asked a Japanese missionary to preach or to speak. But actually, he could speak English very well. I mean, of course, with a bit of accent, but he speaks very well, fluent. But actually, we intentionally asked him to speak in Japanese, his own language, and then next to him, somebody translate. And sitting down, there will be somebody, first language is English, but they will feel a little bit uncomfortable to listen to Japanese. But we need to allow that. Actually, the phrase we use is perhaps the sense of feeling discomfort is part of that journey of being inclusive. You need to feel a bit of uncomfortable. That's actually good for growth as well, to really listen to the voice of the margin. If you always feel comfortable, that means it's always using English, which is not really good. So I think we need to allow that discomfort to sit with us for a bit longer. That's a journey we are learning at this stage.
This whole question about being the margin, I mean, think of it this way. Whenever you think about, one of the comments before was like, well, this other question about, aren't we all God's children? Why can't we fix this thing? I always remind students in saying, think about history and structures of power. That you can't change easily, right? That's basically why. Of course we're all God's children. But when you have such long history, and the roots of that history is in the institutions, it's in the buildings, it's in your history books, in your educational system, how would you change that? Where would you change that, right? So, and I think, and I thought about this too, like the fact that is Hong Kong, or like Hong Kongers, are you on the margins, or are you the center? You might be thinking, well, economically, because a lot of Asian Americans think this way. Economically, a lot of Asian Americans are really well off. What they don't understand is the fact that they don't have cultural power, right? So there's different kinds of power. You might be thinking, well, I'm in the margins because I have a lot of money. Well, I mean, if you go to like Global Theological Academy, it's white American centric. I mean, you will feel it right away. When you go to AAR and the places, it's clear, right? So you might be thinking, well, we're pretty well off. We're Hong Kongers, international global people. Oh, just come to AAR, or AAR's American Academy of Religion. You'll go and you'll realize right away you're on the margins. So I think that's part we're talking about. What does it really mean? I'll give you an example. Asian Americans during the Black Lives Matter protests, it was all happening in the U.S. I mean, everybody was freaking out, right? So a lot of Asian Americans said, oh my goodness, we should participate. We should really. And what did they follow? They followed the white script. Said, oh, we are privileged and we should. And they realized, wait a minute, it doesn't work. Because think about it, they are racial minorities because they were economically well off. They thought they should follow the script of the white majority. But they said, it doesn't work at all. And of course, they knew they weren't black, but they actually needed an Asian American script to navigate that because they were not marginalized economically often, but they were upstream marginalized politically and culturally. So the question is, what does that really mean in terms of like marginalization and seeing yourself that way? So for a lot of Asian Americans, they have to own the fact that they're margins, right? Because they didn't think that they were. Because it's depressing. It's to think of yourself that way, and it's sometimes you have to see yourself. oh, I already am in the margins. Now the other question is, among Asian Americans, the Asian American umbrella you saw, because it's an umbrella of East Asian, Southeast Asian adoptees, multiracial Asian Americans. In this theory of intersectionality in the US, they realized that among any marginalized group, the most privileged particular aspect group within the marginalized group take over the whole group. So among Asian American umbrella, there's a thing called East Asian privilege, and East Asian supremacy, East Asian dominance, where they take over the whole thing. It's like only 30% of the Asian American population is East Asian, but Southeast Asian, gone, disappear. Filipino, oh, who cares? And so I teach my students about East Asian privilege among Asian Americans. Because in that sense, within our group, they're particularly privileged. They say, oh my gosh, but aren't we're the racial minorities. I'm like, it's true. But among the Asian American group, you are the white people. And they said, oh my gosh, that's so offensive. I'm like, but it's true. It's true. So you think about that. Like, so if you find yourself in the margins, well, there's relative privilege, right? And you must think about that. You must think about that aspect of it as well, right? So there is layers and layers of it. I mean, I know I keep on complicating stuff, but the reason why I complicate is because that's what real life looks like. And when you realize, oh yes, that is true. It's not that simple. Are we oppressed? Are we marginal? Are we oppressing? Well, there are layers of it, and you have to think about what is God leading you to do, and what is God shedding the light on for you to respond. Otherwise, it's because a lot of Asian Americans are like, well, the white people, they're the enemy. I'm thinking, but I'll tell you how mad the Filipino Americans are at you, the Korean American who take over the whole thing, right? So those are the aspects I think we have to think about.
It's not clear who is marginalized, right? Sometimes I ask myself, I am the 60s, you understand, 1960 I was born. Am I the marginalized group or am I the privileged group? I'm not sure, it's hard to answer. But Dr. Jackson, I'd like to ask you another more practical issue. I think, in the past few years, a lot of Hong Kong people has emigrated to Canada, Australia, or different countries. If you use the categories of neo, that's called neo, they are barbarians, okay? The reason they live are barbarians. So these so-called barbarians who have gone to those Western countries, they do feel kind of lost, the Western country, they often find life harder than they expect when they first move out, okay? To these people, your kinotheology, in what way can really help those people who has emigrated in the last few years and who kind of struggling identity, livelihood, different ways, how may it become a helpful resources for those people?
Yeah, I think, of course, the Chinese theologian I use is a mainland Chinese theologian. But what, again, I think she's doing for herself in order to then help those members of her community, who's a pastor and a church member, is to find language to describe what she's experiencing. So the vocabulary, the concept. So this is my experience. Does that ring true for you? Oh yeah. That's really helpful. I've never quite understood it in that way before. I've always struggled with this sense of trying to negotiate what it means to be part of this kind of tradition, but living in a different place. And the way you describe it helps me. So there is that, I think, the importance of that kind of work, which is actually helping a community of believers to find ways of talking about what they're experiencing and not just feeling it's overwhelming because I can't grasp it. So that, I think, is helpful. I think the friends I have even who have most successfully made that transition as a result of the journey that you describe are those who find themselves in close relationships, either marriage relationships or just very close friendship groups and circles, and sometimes church community, mixed church community can be part of that, where they have established those close relationships with people who are also part of this cycle of understanding what this experience of being in another place means. I don't know how you make that step, but I do see that those people who have made that step have been most successful at navigating this new change, and particularly, no guarantees, but particularly the people I know who've made that transition most successfully are the people who are in mixed marriages.
Okay, and last chance to ask a question. Anyone? All right, if no question, I'd like to remind you tonight, 7:30, we have the last session. We have Dr. Ruler, who will speak from maybe Middle East context. I'm sure it will be a very excellent lecture, so I do hope to see you tonight. And a big thank you for all the speakers.